Today we're diving deep into one of history's most fascinating and feared warrior cultures, the Vikings, and specifically why they were so incredibly effective in close combat situations. Now, when most people think of Vikings, they might conjure up images from movies or TV shows of massive bearded warriors swinging axes wildly, but the reality is far more complex and infinitely more interesting. The Vikings weren't just random barbarians running around Europe causing chaos. They were actually highly skilled, strategically minded fighters who dominated battlefields across medieval Europe for over 3 centuries. What made them so effective wasn't just their physical prowess or their famous weapons, but a combination of cultural factors, training methods, tactical innovations, and psychological warfare that created what was essentially the perfect storm of medieval combat effectiveness. So grab your favorite drink, get comfortable, and let's explore together why Viking warriors were considered among the most formidable close combat fighters in all of human history. The story of Viking combat effectiveness begins long before they ever set foot on a battlefield, rooted deep in the harsh realities of Scandinavian life during the 8th to 11th centuries. The geography of Scandinavia itself played a crucial role in shaping these warriors. The fjords of Norway, the forests of Sweden, and the rugged coastlines of Denmark created communities that were naturally isolated and self-reliant. In these harsh northern climates, survival wasn't just about finding food and shelter. It was about defending what you had from neighbors who might be facing the same scarcities. This environment created a culture where physical strength, combat skills, and the ability to work as a cohesive unit weren't just admirable traits, they were essential for survival. From childhood, Viking boys were immersed in a culture that valued martial prowess above almost everything else. Unlike many medieval societies where only the nobility received formal combat training, Viking culture was remarkably egalitarian when it came to warrior skills. Farmers, fishermen, craftsmen, they all learned to fight because raids and conflicts were a regular part of life. This meant that when a Viking longship landed on a foreign shore, it wasn't carrying a small elite force of professional warriors. It was carrying dozens of men who had been training for combat their entire lives. The weapons training began early and was comprehensive. Young Vikings learned not just how to swing a sword or throw a spear, but how to maintain their weapons, how to repair them in the field, and how to adapt their fighting style to different types of opponents and terrain. They practiced with wooden weapons first, gradually working their way up to real steel as they demonstrated competence and maturity. But perhaps more importantly, they learned to fight as a unit. Viking combat training emphasized coordination and teamwork in ways that many of their contemporaries did not. The famous shield wall formation, where warriors would stand shoulder to shoulder with their shields overlapping, wasn't something that could be improvised on the battlefield. It required countless hours of practice, trust between warriors, and an almost instinctive understanding of how to move as one organism, while still maintaining individual fighting effectiveness. The weapons themselves tell us a great deal about Viking combat philosophy. While popular culture often focuses on the Viking axe, and indeed axes were common and effective weapons, the reality is that Vikings used a sophisticated array of weapons, each designed for specific tactical situations. The Viking sword, often called a spatha, was a masterpiece of medieval metallurgy. These weren't crude weapons hammered out by local blacksmiths, but sophisticated pieces of technology that represented the pinnacle of iron and steelworking knowledge of their time. Many Viking swords were made using pattern welding, a complex technique where iron and steel were twisted and folded together to create blades that were both flexible and incredibly sharp. The process was so complex and time-consuming that a single sword could take months to complete and cost the equivalent of several farms. This meant that Viking swords weren't just weapons, they were status symbols, family heirlooms, and objects of almost mystical significance. The Vikings gave their swords names, treated them as partners rather than tools, and passed them down through generations. This deep connection between warrior and weapon created a level of familiarity and skill that was difficult for enemies to match. A Viking warrior might have trained with the same sword for decades, knowing its balance, its reach, its strengths and limitations as intimately as he knew his own body. The Viking axe, while less expensive and more common than swords, was no less sophisticated in its design and application. The bearded axe, with its distinctive curved blade, was particularly effective in close combat because it could be used not just for chopping, but for hooking shields, tripping opponents, and even grappling. The long handle gave Vikings reach, advantage over opponents with shorter weapons, while the weight distribution made it possible to generate tremendous force with relatively little effort. Vikings also developed specialized fighting techniques with axes that took advantage of their unique properties. They could catch an opponent's weapon on the beard of the axe and twist it out of their hands, or use the backspike found on many war axes to punch through mail armor. The versatility of the Viking axe made it an ideal weapon for the chaotic, unpredictable nature of medieval combat. Spears were perhaps the most common Viking weapon, and for good reason. They were relatively inexpensive to produce, effective at multiple ranges, and could be used effectively by warriors with varying levels of training. The Viking spear wasn't just a simple pointed stick, it was a carefully balanced weapon, with a leaf-shaped blade that could thrust, slash, and even be thrown with deadly accuracy. In formation fighting, spears allowed Vikings to attack enemies before they could close to sword or axe range, while in individual combat, a skilled spear fighter could keep multiple opponents at bay. The shield was arguably as important as any offensive weapon in the Viking arsenal. The round shields used by Vikings were typically made of linden wood, chosen for its lightweight and ability to absorb impacts without splitting. The shields were reinforced with iron bands and featured a central boss that could be used offensively to strike opponents, but the shield was more than just passive protection. It was an integral part of Viking fighting technique. Vikings learned to use their shields aggressively, pushing with them, striking with the rim, and using them to control distance and timing in combat. The famous shield wall formation demonstrated the defensive potential of these shields when used collectively, but individual Vikings also developed sophisticated shield techniques that allowed them to fight effectively against multiple opponents. The psychological aspects of Viking warfare were as important as their physical weapons and techniques. Vikings cultivated a fearsome reputation that often won battles before they began. The berserkers, warriors who fought in a trance-like fury, became legendary throughout Europe and struck terror into the hearts of their enemies. While modern historians debate the exact nature of berserker rage, whether it was drug-induced, religious ecstasy, or simply psychological conditioning, there is no doubt that it was effective as a psychological weapon. The mere possibility that they might face berserkers in battle was enough to shake the morale of opposing forces. But berserkers were just the most extreme example of Viking psychological warfare. All Viking warriors cultivated an image of fearlessness and savagery that was carefully calculated to intimidate opponents. They would beat their weapons against their shields before battle, creating a thunderous din that could be heard for miles. They would shout war cries and boast of their previous victories, recounting in graphic detail what they planned to do to their enemies. This wasn't just mindless brutality, it was sophisticated psychological manipulation designed to create fear and uncertainty in opposing ranks. The Vikings understood that a frightened enemy was a defeated enemy, even before the first blow was struck. The religious and cultural context of Viking warfare also contributed to their effectiveness in close combat. The Norse religion, with its emphasis on dying gloriously in battle to earn a place in Valhalla, created warriors who genuinely did not fear death. This wasn't just bravado or posturing. It was a deeply held religious belief that fundamentally changed how Vikings approached combat. A warrior who believes that dying bravely in battle guarantees him eternal feasting and fighting in the halls of the gods is going to fight very differently than one who sees death as the end of everything. This religious framework created warriors who were genuinely willing to take risks that others would consider suicidal, to press attacks when others would retreat, and to stand their ground when others would flee. The concept of honor in Viking culture was also closely tied to combat performance. A Viking's reputation, his standing in the community, his ability to attract followers and make advantageous marriages all depended on his performance in battle. This created intense social pressure to excel in combat, but it also created a warrior culture where cowardice was not just personally shameful, but socially devastating. Vikings fought not just for plunder or territory, but for their very identity as men and as members of their community. This psychological framework created warriors who would rather die fighting than live with the shame of cowardice. The tactical innovations of Viking warfare were numerous and significant. The shield wall formation has already been mentioned, but it's worth exploring in more detail because it was fundamental to Viking success in large-scale battles. The shield wall wasn't just a defensive formation, it was a sophisticated tactical system that could be adapted to different situations and terrains. In its basic form, warriors would stand shoulder to shoulder with their shields overlapping, creating an impenetrable wall of wood and iron. Spears would protrude from between the shields, creating a deadly hedge that was extremely difficult for enemies to approach. But skilled Viking commanders could manipulate the shield wall in more complex ways. They could create gaps to allow their own warriors to charge through, then close the gaps behind them. They could angle the wall to funnel enemies into killing zones or curve it to surround and trap opposing forces. The shield wall could advance as a unit, maintaining its integrity while slowly pushing back enemy formations. Or it could hold ground while other Viking forces attacked from the flanks. The effectiveness of the shield wall depended not just on the individual skill of the warriors, but on their ability to trust and coordinate with their companions. Vikings also developed sophisticated small unit tactics that were particularly effective in the raid situations that made them famous. When a longship full of Vikings landed on an enemy shore, they weren't just a mob of individual warriors. They were a coordinated military unit with specific roles and responsibilities. Some warriors would secure the landing area and guard the ships. Others would scout ahead to identify targets and threats, while the main force would advance in formation toward their objective. Vikings became masters of the surprise attack, using their superior mobility and intelligence gathering to strike at enemies when and where they were least expected. They would land at night or in bad weather, when their approach was less likely to be detected, and they would gather detailed intelligence about their targets before committing to an attack. This might include information about the number of defenders, the layout of fortifications, the location of valuables, and the best routes for advance and retreat. This level of planning and preparation was sophisticated military thinking that went far beyond the barbaric raid stereotype. The adaptability of Viking warriors was another key factor in their combat effectiveness. Unlike many medieval armies that were trained for specific types of warfare, Vikings had to be ready to fight in a wide variety of situations and environments. They might face heavily armored knights in open battle one day, then have to storm a fortified monastery the next, followed by ship-to-ship combat at sea. This variety of combat situations meant that Vikings couldn't rely on a single set of tactics or techniques. They had to be versatile and adaptable. Viking warriors became skilled at reading situations quickly and adjusting their approach accordingly. They could fight in formation when the situation called for it, or as individuals when circumstances required. They could use terrain to their advantage, whether fighting in forests, on beaches, in narrow streets, or on the decks of ships. This adaptability was partly a result of their varied training, but it was also a product of the diverse experiences that came from a lifetime of raiding and warfare. The physical conditioning of Viking warriors was also exceptional by medieval standards. The harsh Scandinavian environment created naturally tough, resilient people, but Vikings took physical conditioning seriously as a deliberate part of their warrior training. Swimming was considered an essential skill, not just for safety around the water-dominated Scandinavian landscape, but as a form of physical conditioning and as a combat skill in its own right. Vikings were known to fight battles while partially submerged in water, and their superior swimming abilities gave them tactical advantages in coastal and riverine environments. Wrestling was another important component of Viking physical training. Wrestling built the kind of functional strength that was essential in close combat, where battles often devolved into grappling matches. Vikings developed sophisticated wrestling techniques that could be applied in armored combat, learning how to use an opponent's armor and weapons against them, how to trip and throw armored opponents, and how to maintain balance and leverage. In chaotic melee situations, the endurance conditioning of Viking warriors was also remarkable. Raiding expeditions could last for months and involve long marches overland and extended periods of rowing. Vikings needed to be able to fight effectively at the end of these grueling journeys, often against fresh opponents who had been waiting in prepared positions. This required a level of cardiovascular fitness and muscular endurance that was developed through years of hard physical labor and dedicated training. The weapons training of Vikings was notable for its realism and intensity. Unlike some medieval martial traditions that emphasized formal techniques and ritualized combat, Viking weapons training was brutally practical. Vikings practiced with real weapons whenever possible, and their training scenarios were designed to replicate the chaos and unpredictability of actual combat. They would practice fighting multiple opponents, fighting while wounded or exhausted, fighting in poor visibility, and fighting on unstable surfaces like ship decks. This realistic training prepared them for the harsh realities of medieval combat in ways that more formalized martial training often did not. The social structure of Viking society also contributed to their combat effectiveness. While Vikings are often portrayed as wild individualists, the reality is that successful Viking warriors were part of tight-knit social units that functioned almost like extended families. A Viking warrior's loyalty was first to his immediate companions, the men he fought alongside regularly, then to his chieftain or king, and finally to his broader community. This hierarchy of loyalty created strong bonds between warriors that translated into exceptional unit cohesion in combat. Vikings fought not just for personal glory or plunder, but to protect their brothers in arms, and this mutual loyalty made Viking military units extremely resilient under pressure. The economic aspects of Viking warfare also played a role in their combat effectiveness. Unlike feudal armies where warriors were fighting for their lord's benefit, Vikings had a direct economic stake in the success of their military expeditions. Plunder was typically divided among the participants according to predetermined shares, which meant that every warrior had a personal financial incentive to ensure the success of the raid. This economic motivation complemented the social and religious factors that drove Viking warriors, creating a powerful combination of incentives that made them formidable opponents. The intelligence-gathering capabilities of Viking raiders were far more sophisticated than is commonly understood. Vikings were excellent sailors and navigators who traveled throughout the known world from Greenland to Constantinople, and they used these travels to gather military intelligence about potential targets. They would often trade peacefully with communities they later raided, using these commercial relationships to learn about defenses, routines, and vulnerabilities. Viking merchants would note the locations of treasure, the strength of fortifications, and the patterns of daily life that could be exploited by raiders. This intelligence network gave Vikings significant advantages in planning and executing their attacks. The technological innovations of Viking warriors extended beyond weapons to include improvements in armor and protective equipment. While Vikings are often portrayed as fighting without armor, the reality is that successful Viking warriors typically wore some form of protection. Mail shirts, called byrni, were common among wealthy Vikings and provided excellent protection against the cutting attacks that were the norm in medieval combat. These mail shirts were expensive and time-consuming to produce, but they were so effective that they remained the standard form of armor for centuries. Vikings also wore helmets, though these were typically simple, conical designs, rather than the horned helmets of popular imagination. The famous horned helmets, while they did exist in Scandinavian culture, were ceremonial rather than combat items and would have been impractical and dangerous in actual fighting. The adaptation of Viking tactics to different environments and opponents was a key factor in their long-term success. When Vikings first began raiding the British Isles and the European coast, they were primarily fighting against poorly organized local militias and lightly defended monasteries. Their superior weapons, training, and organization gave them overwhelming advantages in these early encounters, but as their reputation spread and their opponents began to adapt, Vikings were forced to evolve their own tactics and strategies. They learned to deal with heavily fortified positions, organized military opposition, and increasingly sophisticated defensive measures. This adaptability kept them militarily relevant for centuries, even as the political and military landscape of Europe changed around them. The logistics of Viking warfare were also remarkably sophisticated. Maintaining a force of warriors on extended raids required careful planning and resource management. Vikings had to ensure adequate supplies of food, water, weapons, and medical supplies for expeditions that could last months and cover thousands of miles. They developed efficient systems for resupply, often through a combination of plunder, trade, and pre-positioned supply caches. The famous Viking longships were not just transportation, they were mobile bases that could support extended military operations far from home. The psychological impact of Viking raids extended far beyond their immediate military effects. The unpredictability of Viking attacks created a climate of fear and uncertainty that affected entire regions. Communities never knew when or where Vikings might strike next, which disrupted normal economic and social activities and forced costly defensive preparations. This psychological warfare was as effective as their physical combat capabilities in achieving Viking strategic objectives. The legacy of Viking combat effectiveness can be seen in the lasting impact they had on medieval European military development. Many of the tactical innovations and organizational principles developed by Vikings were eventually adopted by their opponents and incorporated into the evolving medieval military system. The emphasis on individual warrior skill combined with unit cohesion, the use of psychological warfare, and the integration of mobility and striking power all became standard elements of medieval military doctrine. Even after the end of the Viking Age, the reputation and legend of Viking warriors continued to influence military thinking and popular culture. Understanding why Viking raiders were so effective in close combat requires looking beyond the simple explanations of superior weapons or natural ferocity to examine the complex interplay of cultural, technological, tactical, and psychological factors that created one of history's most formidable warrior traditions. The Vikings succeeded not because they were naturally more violent or aggressive than their contemporaries, but because they developed a comprehensive approach to warfare that addressed every aspect of military effectiveness, from individual training to strategic planning. Their legacy reminds us that military success in any era requires not just good equipment and brave soldiers, but careful thought, thorough preparation, and the ability to adapt and evolve in response to changing circumstances. The training regimens of Viking warriors were passed down through generations, creating a continuous tradition of martial excellence that refined and improved over centuries. Fathers taught sons not just the basic techniques of swordplay and shield work, but the deeper philosophies of combat that separated true warriors from mere fighters. These lessons began in childhood with wooden weapons and simple exercises, but gradually evolved into complex training scenarios that tested every aspect of a warrior's capabilities. Young Vikings learned to fight blindfolded, to develop their other senses, to battle while carrying heavy loads to build functional strength, and to maintain their weapons in the field under adverse conditions. The most promising young warriors were often sent to train with renowned fighters in other communities, creating a network of shared knowledge and techniques that spread throughout the Viking world. This exchange of martial knowledge meant that Viking combat techniques were constantly evolving and improving, incorporating the best ideas from across Scandinavia and beyond. The mentorship system also created strong bonds between experienced warriors and their students, relationships that often lasted throughout their lives and created the foundation for the tight-knit warrior bands that were so characteristic of Viking military organization. The seasonal nature of Viking raiding also played a crucial role in their combat effectiveness. Most Viking raids took place during the spring and summer months when weather conditions were favorable for sea travel, but this timing also meant that Vikings spent their winters preparing for the next raiding season. These winter months were intensively used for weapons training, physical conditioning, and tactical planning. Viking communities would organize elaborate training exercises that simulated the conditions they expected to encounter during the raiding season, including mock battles, endurance challenges, and complex tactical scenarios. The long winter nights were perfect for storytelling sessions where experienced warriors would share their knowledge with younger men, recounting battles they had fought, techniques they had learned, and mistakes they had made. These stories served not just as entertainment, but as crucial tactical education, passing down hard-won battlefield wisdom from one generation to the next. The competitive nature of Viking society also drove continuous improvement in combat skills. Warriors competed constantly with each other in formal and informal contests, from simple strength competitions to complex martial arts tournaments. These competitions served multiple purposes beyond simple entertainment. They allowed warriors to test their skills against different opponents and fighting styles. They identified the most promising fighters for leadership roles, and they maintained the competitive edge that was essential for battlefield success. The stakes of these competitions were often significant, with winners gaining prestige, followers, and material rewards that could change their social status. This competitive environment created a culture of continuous improvement, where warriors were always striving to perfect their techniques and develop new capabilities. The integration of Viking combat training with their seafaring culture created unique advantages that their land-based opponents often couldn't match. Fighting on the deck of a longship required different skills than fighting on solid ground, and Vikings developed specialized techniques for ship-to-ship combat that took advantage of their superior seamanship. They learned to use the motion of the waves to their advantage, timing their attacks to coincide with the ship's roll to generate additional force. They practiced fighting while maintaining balance on wet, slippery decks, and they developed techniques for boarding enemy vessels that combined acrobatic skill with martial prowess. The confined spaces of ship decks also required different tactical approaches than open battlefield combat, and Vikings became masters of close quarters, fighting in cramped conditions. These skills translated directly to other confined combat environments like narrow streets, building interiors, and fortified positions, giving Vikings significant advantages in urban warfare and siege situations. The maritime culture of the Vikings also influenced their approach to logistics and supply in ways that enhanced their combat effectiveness. Viking longships could carry not just warriors, but also their equipment, supplies, and even horses when necessary. This mobility allowed Viking forces to appear suddenly in unexpected locations, often far from where their enemies expected them. The shallow draft of Viking ships meant they could navigate rivers and coastal waters that were inaccessible to larger vessels, allowing them to strike deep into enemy territory along waterways. This combination of surprise, mobility, and logistical capability made Viking raiders incredibly difficult to defend against, as they could strike quickly and disappear before effective opposition could be organized. The psychological effect of this unpredictability was enormous, as no coastal or riverside community could ever feel completely safe from Viking attack. The role of women in Viking society also contributed indirectly to the combat effectiveness of Viking warriors. While women rarely participated directly in raids and battles, they played crucial roles in the warrior culture that produced such effective fighters. Viking women were responsible for maintaining the household economy that supported warrior activities, but they also played important roles in the social and psychological aspects of warrior culture. They were often the keepers of family honor and tradition, encouraging their men to live up to the heroic ideals of their ancestors. Viking women also participated in the religious ceremonies and rituals that were so important to warrior psychology, helping to maintain the spiritual framework that made Vikings such fearless fighters. In some cases, Viking women even participated in combat training, not necessarily to become warriors themselves, but to better understand and support the martial culture of their society. The legendary shield maidens, while probably less common than popular culture suggests, were not entirely mythical, and their existence demonstrates the extent to which Viking society was oriented around martial values. The economic foundations of Viking society were also crucial to their military success. The agricultural and trading activities that sustained Viking communities during peacetime provided the economic surplus necessary to support professional warriors and to fund expensive military expeditions. Viking craftsmen produced not just the weapons and armor used by their warriors, but also the ships, tools, and other equipment necessary for successful raiding. The wealth generated by successful raids was reinvested in better equipment, larger ships, and more extensive training, creating a positive feedback loop that continuously improved Viking military capabilities. The trading networks established by Viking merchants also provided valuable intelligence about potential targets and routes, while the diplomatic relationships developed through trade sometimes provided allies and bases of operation for military activities. This integration of economic and military activities was a key factor in the long-term success of Viking expansion and conquest. The religious and mythological framework of Viking culture provided powerful psychological resources that enhanced combat effectiveness in ways that are difficult for modern people to fully appreciate. The Norse pantheon was filled with warrior gods like Odin and Thor, who served as role models and sources of inspiration for mortal fighters. The concept of Ragnarok, the prophesied end of the world in a great battle, created a cosmic context for individual combat that made every fight part of a larger spiritual struggle. The Valkyries, who were said to choose which warriors would die in battle and escort them to Valhalla, provided a framework for understanding death in combat as a form of divine selection rather than random tragedy. These religious beliefs weren't just abstract theology, but practical psychological tools that helped Viking warriors manage the fear and stress of combat. The ritual aspects of Viking warrior culture also provided important psychological benefits. Pre-battle ceremonies, the blessing of weapons, and the invocation of divine protection all served to focus the warrior's mind and prepare him psychologically for combat. The aftermath of battle also included rituals for honoring the dead and celebrating the living that helped warriors process the trauma of combat and maintain their psychological health. The burial practices of Viking warriors, with their emphasis on grave goods and preparation for the afterlife, demonstrated the society's respect for those who died in battle and reinforced the honor associated with warrior death. The international scope of Viking activities also contributed to their combat effectiveness by exposing them to a wide variety of fighting styles, weapons, and tactical approaches. Vikings who raided in Ireland learned different lessons than those who fought in France or traveled to Constantinople. And this diversity of experience was shared throughout the Viking world through the networks of kinship and alliance that connected. Different communities. Vikings encountered heavily armored Frankish cavalry, Byzantine infantry formations, Arab light cavalry, and Slavic warriors, each with their own distinctive approaches to warfare. This exposure to diverse military traditions made Vikings adaptable and innovative, constantly incorporating new techniques and technologies into their own fighting systems. The cosmopolitan nature of Viking society, with its extensive trade networks and diplomatic relationships, ensured that military innovations and tactical lessons learned in one region quickly spread throughout the Viking world. The craftsmanship and technology behind Viking weapons and equipment was far more sophisticated than many people realize, representing the cutting edge of medieval metallurgy and engineering. The pattern-welded swords carried by wealthy Vikings were technological, marvels that required master craftsmen and expensive materials to produce. The process of pattern welding involved twisting and folding different grades of iron and steel to create blades that combined the best properties of each material, resulting in weapons that were both flexible and hard, able to hold a sharp edge, while resisting breakage. The decorative patterns created by this process weren't just aesthetic choices, but visual indicators of the weapon's quality and the skill of its maker. Viking armorers also developed sophisticated techniques for producing mail armor that was both protective and flexible, using wire drawing technology that was advanced for its time. The iron and steel used in Viking weapons often came from bog iron deposits that were carefully selected and processed to achieve the desired properties, while the finest weapons incorporated steel traded from as far away as India and Central Asia. The attention to detail in Viking weapon production extended to every aspect of their equipment, from the carefully shaped wooden handles that provided optimal grip and balance to the leather and textile components that allowed for comfortable, extended use. The tactical flexibility of Viking warfare was another key factor in their success, as they were able to adapt their fighting methods to a wide variety of opponents and situations. Against lightly armored opponents like the monks and farmers they often encountered in their early raids, Vikings could rely on speed and aggression to achieve quick victories. Against more heavily armored opponents like Frankish knights, they developed tactics that emphasized mobility, coordination, and the use of specialized weapons like long-handled axes that could penetrate armor. In siege situations, Vikings learned to use their ships as mobile platforms for attacking coastal fortifications, while their experience with construction and carpentry allowed them to build effective siege equipment when necessary. The naval combat capabilities of Vikings were also highly developed, with specialized techniques for ramming, boarding, and ship-to-ship missile combat that gave them significant advantages over less experienced naval opponents. This tactical flexibility was based on a deep understanding of the strengths and weaknesses of different fighting methods, and the ability to choose the most appropriate approach for each specific situation. The leadership structure of Viking military organizations was also crucial to their combat effectiveness, combining democratic elements with strong central authority in ways that maximized both individual initiative and collective coordination. Viking war bands were typically organized around a central leader, often called a jarl or king, who had proven his competence through previous military successes. This leader was responsible for overall strategy and coordination, but individual warriors and small unit leaders retained significant autonomy in tactical decision-making. This decentralized command structure allowed Viking forces to respond quickly to changing battlefield conditions without waiting for orders from higher authority, while still maintaining the overall coordination necessary for complex tactical maneuvers. The selection of leaders was based primarily on demonstrated competence rather than hereditary status, which meant that Viking military organizations were led by their most capable members rather than by accident of birth. This meritocratic approach to leadership created strong motivation for individual excellence and ensured that Viking forces were generally well led at all levels. The communication systems used by Viking forces were also sophisticated, employing a combination of horn signals, flag signals, and prearranged tactical plans that allowed for effective coordination even in the chaos of battle. The psychological conditioning of Viking warriors went far beyond simple courage or ferocity to include sophisticated mental training that prepared them for the psychological challenges of combat. Vikings understood that fear was a natural human response to danger, but they developed techniques for managing and channeling that fear in constructive ways. Meditation and mental visualization exercises helped warriors prepare for combat scenarios before they actually occurred, while breathing techniques and mental focus exercises helped them maintain concentration during the stress of battle. The ritual use of stimulants like alcohol and possibly hallucinogenic substances also played a role in psychological preparation, though these were used carefully and in controlled circumstances rather than as simple intoxicants. The berserker tradition, while often misunderstood, represented a sophisticated form of psychological conditioning that allowed certain warriors to enter altered states of consciousness that enhanced their combat effectiveness. The training for berserker status involved years of physical and mental conditioning that taught warriors to dissociate from physical pain and fear while maintaining tactical awareness and combat skill. This wasn't mindless rage, but a controlled psychological state that could be entered and exited at will, allowing berserkers to function as shock troops who could break enemy formations and create opportunities for their more conventionally fighting companions. The social support systems that helped Viking warriors maintain their psychological health were also important factors in their long-term effectiveness. The strong bonds between warrior companions provided emotional support during difficult times, while the ritual and ceremonial aspects of warrior culture helped individuals process the trauma and stress of combat. The storytelling traditions that celebrated heroic deeds and honored fallen warriors helped maintain morale and provide psychological resources for dealing with loss and setbacks. The integration of warrior culture with family and community life meant that Viking fighters had strong social identities beyond their military roles, providing psychological stability and motivation that purely professional soldiers often lacked. The medical knowledge and battlefield medicine practices of Vikings were also more advanced than is commonly understood, contributing to their effectiveness by allowing wounded warriors to recover and return to combat more quickly. Viking medical practitioners, often women who specialized in healing arts, developed sophisticated techniques for treating wounds, setting bones, and managing infections. The use of herbal medicines and surgical procedures was based on centuries of accumulated knowledge and experience, much of which was remarkably effective by medieval standards. The portable medical kits carried by Viking war bands included tools and supplies for treating common battlefield injuries, while the medical knowledge possessed by many warriors themselves allowed for effective first aid and emergency treatment. The ability to treat wounds quickly and effectively in the field was crucial for maintaining the combat effectiveness of Viking forces during extended campaigns, as untreated injuries could quickly disable even the most skilled warriors. The field hospitals established by Viking forces during major campaigns were sophisticated medical facilities that could handle complex surgical procedures and provide extended care for seriously wounded warriors. The story of Viking combat effectiveness is ultimately a story about the power of culture and community to shape individual behavior and collective capability. In a harsh world where survival often depended on the ability to fight effectively, the Vikings created a society that produced warriors who were not just skilled and brave, but adaptable, intelligent, and utterly committed to their craft. This combination of factors made them nearly unbeatable in the close combat situations that defined medieval warfare, and their reputation as master warriors was well earned through centuries of battlefield success. From the fjords of Norway to the monasteries of Ireland, from the trading posts of Russia to the battlefields of England, Viking warriors proved again and again that they were among the most effective close combat fighters in human history. And their legacy continues to fascinate and inspire us more than 1,000 years after the end of the Viking Age. The comprehensive nature of Viking warrior culture, encompassing everything from childhood training to religious belief, from weapons, technology to battlefield medicine, created a military system that was remarkably effective and enduring. Their success came not from any single factor, but from the integration of numerous elements into a coherent whole that maximized human potential for warfare while maintaining the social and psychological structures necessary for long-term success. Understanding the full scope of Viking combat effectiveness requires appreciating not just their individual skills and equipment, but the entire cultural matrix that produced and sustained one of history's most formidable warrior traditions.